I've done a couple of videos already on creatine, and today I'm going to talk a little bit more about it for a reason. Although my past videos have covered most of the basics that you need to know about creatine, I came across a study that's introducing still another form of creatine. I'm sure you're going to hear about this one because it seems to have a lot of hype associated with it. But in this video, I'm going to tell you the truth as far as I know right now. But let me briefly review some of the other forms of creatine so you can get an idea of what I'm leading up to. First of all, creatine. What is creatine? It's an amino acid byproduct produced from 3 amino acids: glycine, arginine, and what's the other one? Glycine, arginine. I don't remember the third one. It's produced by three amino acids. Methionine is the third one. Glycine, arginine, and methionine. It's produced in the mainly in the liver, some in the kidneys, and a little bit in the pancreas. Creatine is produced 1 gram a day in the human body. You also, if you eat meat and fish, you also get another gram from food. So average production is about 2 grams, 1 gram from endogenous, the body, the other gram from food. Of course, if you're a vegetarian, you don't eat fish or meat, you're not getting that extra gram. All you're getting is the 1 gram that your body produces naturally. And your body always does produce it, which right away tells you something about creatine. When people wonder about the safety of creatine, you know, the first thing to consider is that it's a natural chemical produced in the body from amino acids. So can't be naturally toxic. Although the principle of hormesis still states that anything taken in excess can start to become toxic, including things like water, aspirin, other common things. Exercise, too much exercise, you start to get a U-shaped curve, where instead of making gains, you start losing muscle if you work out too much and don't get enough rest. So that's the way life is. It follows a hormesis pattern. And same with creatine. Theoretically, large amounts could cause problems. I don't know of any studies that have indicated somebody has been poisoned by creatine. The few cases on record where people had medical problems usually had to do with somebody with pre-existing kidney disease, serious kidney disease. And with kidney disease, people have a problem processing the primary breakdown product of creatine, which is creatinine, which is excreted through the kidneys. But even there, it's kind of a gray area. In other words, nobody's gotten kidney failure from ingesting creatine, although rumors like that appear on the internet. When you ingest a creatine supplement, there's different ways to do it. I'm not going to really go into the different ways. One of them's a creatine load phase. I'm not going to really go into it. I've discussed it in previous videos. The other one's just taking a teaspoon a day, 5 grams of creatine. At the end of 30 days, your muscles will be loaded with creatine. Using a creatine supplement, you can increase your muscle stores of creatine by 40%. What the studies show is average strength gain after using creatine supplements. The average strength gain overall is 10%. A 2017 study that looked at 53 different studies, it was a meta-analysis they call that. It concluded that after ingesting creatine, you get a 5% increase in upper body exercises, such as chest exercises. A 2015 study also looked at various studies of creatine and exercise performance, and they concluded that the average strength gain after a creatine supplement usage is 8%. For example, 8% stronger in squats. A 2002 study showed another aspect of creatine, which is that it reduces mental fatigue. In fact, there was an interesting study done around the same time that showed if you're sleep deprived, for example, if you don't get enough, let's say 7 hours sleep, let's say you get 4 hours, taking creatine will actually wake up your brain. It doesn't preclude the need for sleep. You're still going to get in serious trouble with it from a lack of sleep, such as insulin resistance, lowering testosterone, increase of cortisol. However, taking some creatine will actually get your brain going again, because it is a fuel for the brain. In other words, the primary purpose of creatine is to help the body produce adenosine triphosphate, ATP, which is the most elemental source of energy for cells, including in the brain. Now, what about the various types of creatine supplements? And this is what I'm leading up to, because again, the main basis for this video is I want to talk about this brand new form of creatine. To my knowledge, it's not on the market yet. I tried to find studies on this in the Public Library of Medicine. There was literally no studies. I came across this study in an abstract form, in a professional journal called Clinical Nutrition. This is the only thing I was able to find. But let's talk about the other forms of creatine, and you'll understand my conclusion about this new form. All right, the most basic form of creatine, of course, is creatine monohydrate. It consists of 90% creatine. It's basically creatine with a little bit of water. It's highly absorbable. Some people say it's not very soluble in water, but you know, I have strong doubts about that because it's 99% absorbed. There are alternatives. Some people say they get stomach cramps and digestive upsets when they use creatine monohydrate. This is an outside possibility. If that happens, you might want to ingest more soluble forms of creatine, such as creatine nitrate, creatine citrate, and creatine malate. Now, it's important to note, none of those other forms of creatine have any actual ergogenic benefits over plain old creatine monohydrate, but they're a little bit more soluble, so they won't attract as much water to the gut. So it'll actually, you know, if you have a tendency to cramps when you ingest creatine, those other forms will actually tend to prevent that. Another tip, and I've said this in past videos, is to ensure that you increase your fluid intake when you're taking creatine, because again, creatine tends to cause a slight dehydrating effect. It tends to pull water out of the blood, and you know, this can also cause some problems. So you have to increase your fluid intake. That will also prevent a lot of side effects with creatine. So creatine monohydrate is the standard form of creatine. Most of the studies that have shown benefits, in fact, I'd say 99.9% of all published studies on creatine, the benefit has come from creatine monohydrate. You can call it the plain vanilla original creatine. Now, there's another form. I've written about this. I've talked about it a couple of years ago. Gee, I don't know how long ago it was, maybe 10, 15 years ago, maybe more. The bodybuilding supplement world was hit by this impending news of the greatest creatine ever produced. Ads touted that it was 4,000% better than creatine monohydrate, which right away aroused my suspicion. And it turned out to be a stuff called creatine ethyl ester. The way it was introduced, they tried to portray it as a brand new form of creatine, which itself was a false assertion. Creatine ethyl ester was actually first synthesized in the 1920s. A medical journal article published in 1928 found that creatine ethyl ester was a great substance to test the effects of energy production in cell because it was a very ineffective form of creatine. In other words, this 1928 article was advising physicians that this form of creatine doesn't work. This is 1928. In 1955, they did another study, again testing creatine ethyl ester, again finding no effects whatsoever. Yet, somebody dug out the old research and resurrected this creatine ethyl ester. The basis of it was that because it was like it was creatine attached to a kind of an alcohol. You know, alcohol is absorbed very fast through the membranes in the stomach, and the idea was that creatine ethyl ester, because of the ethyl attachment, would be much more soluble and absorbed in much greater quantities than normal creatine. What they didn't take into account was that there are enzymes called esterases in the intestine that break off creatine ethyl ester from its ester attachment, so it becomes regular old creatine. But in the course of that happening, the creatine is rapidly converted into creatinine, which is the main waste product of creatine production. Creatinine has no ergogenic effects, and neither did creatine ethyl ester. It doesn't work. A 2009 study tested it thoroughly, found it turned right into creatinine in 30 minutes. Junk. Creatine ethyl ester, probably the worst form of creatine you could take. Yet I see many websites and blogs touting it as the best form of creatine, which just is hilarious. To anybody who knows anything about biochemistry, just laughs at that stuff. It's sad that people believe these people. They toss around a couple of big words and they convince people that it's the truth. And if you were to check into it, you'd find that 99 out of 100 times these people have some association with a company that's selling creatine ethyl ester. The lesson here, be careful who you trust. Be careful who you trust. Another form that's highly touted is creatine HCl. One brand name I think is called Concrete, if I remember correctly. This again it is more soluble. It's more soluble than regular creatine monohydrate. It's actually 30 times more soluble than creatine monohydrate. So right away you're probably thinking, well, this must be a better form. Yeah, it's more soluble. It gets into the blood faster, but that doesn't mean jack crap, because creatine has to get into the muscle. The amount of creatine circulating in the blood doesn't mean a damn thing. Don't be fooled by this stuff, these ads that say 60 times greater blood circulation of creatine from this product. That's hype. That's bogus. It's the creatine in the muscle that counts. And creatine uptake in muscle is limited by the creatine carrier. There's a creatine carrier muscle. That's what determines the creatine uptake. Makes no difference how much gets in your blood. However, if you have trouble with gastrointestinal side effects, you can take creatine HCl. It is more soluble. It's also about 5 or 6 times more expensive than creatine monohydrate. So be prepared to pay more. Another form that's touted as being more soluble is buffered creatine. Buffered creatine basically is buffered creatine. In other words, it's kind of synthesized in such a way that it's supposedly a little bit easier absorbed. The particles of creatine are smaller. However, when they've compared buffered creatine to regular creatine monohydrate, no difference. Same exact ergogenic effects, no difference. Liquid creatine, again, probably right up there with creatine ethyl ester is one of the worst. Liquid creatine, you'll find that most of them contain, the liquid creatine supplements, most of them contain less than 1% creatine per entire bottle. And also, most of the creatine there has already been degraded into creatinine. Total waste of money. Don't buy liquid creatine. Garbage. Creatine magnesium. The idea is that magnesium actually is needed to produce ATP. In other words, it's important in the, let's say, the production and function of ATP. Magnesium is. It also activates 300 other enzymes in the body. So somebody got the idea of combining creatine with magnesium, creatine magnesium. Unfortunately, the studies show that there is no difference in ergogenic effects between creatine magnesium and creatine monohydrate. Again, you're paying a lot more money, you're not getting any more benefit. I already talked about micronized creatine, which is very small particles of creatine. Again, might be a little bit of benefit if you have trouble with stomach cramps and that type of thing, but no advantage ergogenically between micronized creatine and standard creatine monohydrate. Creatine, one called creatine pyruvate. Pyruvate is a metabolite. It's used in the process called glycolysis. I'm not going to get into the biochemistry here, but it also shows when you take creatine pyruvate, you get a greater plasma level of creatine. Again, I'm sorry to be redundant. It doesn't mean a damn thing. In other words, there's no advantage of creatine pyruvate over creatine monohydrate. Creatine nitrate. That's that's creatine combined with nitrates. Nitrates are the precursors for nitric oxide. Somehow somebody got the idea that combining creatine with nitrates would produce a superior form of creatine. It does not. In fact, there was a controversy for a while where they thought creatine nitrate actually might be toxic, but subsequent studies showed that it was not toxic, but it also shows no advantages over creatine monohydrate. So I think you're probably beginning to see a pattern here. All these new creatines, these new revolutionary creatines, they all have the hyperbolic ads, 5,000% better, great gains, tremendous energy. They all turn out to be, in a word, bullshit. They're no better than cheap old creatine monohydrate. Now let's talk about what I found here on the internet the other day. It's a new form of creatine. It's what they call colloidal creatine. What is colloidal creatine? A colloid is a substance that's kind of like a box in a box. It's a substance that envelops another substance. By doing so, they think that this would cause greater uptake, and in certain cases, colloidal supplements actually do increase absorption. For example, a common supplement called curcumin. If you provide it in a colloidal form, it is absorbed much better than standard curcumin. However, what about this form of creatine is based on the fact that colloids sometimes do increase absorption. By the way, you might have heard of colloidal minerals. that also is supposed to increase mineral absorption. Don't use them. Colloidal minerals are also contain lead, arsenic, and other toxic heavy metals. Don't use colloidal minerals. Use standard purified minerals. Back to colloidal creatine. The trade name is Creafil. This was published by a company in Germany that's probably going to market this. So right away there's a red herring for you, because there's an ulterior motive. They're going to be selling this creatine. I'm going to read you directly. It's a short abstract, so I'm just going to read it directly. Rationale: a novel colloidal creatine formulation, Creafil, seems to be superior to creatine monohydrate for improving plasma creatine level. Here we go again. Plasma creatine doesn't mean a thing. It's how much. See, this is deceitful, because they're making you think that because the plasma or blood level is higher, that means that more is going to get into your muscle. Not true. Anyway, it says improving plasma creatine levels after single dose administration in animal research. I looked for the animal research, found none. If they did animal research, it's in-house. They didn't publish it. However, does Creafil supremely affect creatine levels in the skeletal muscle and blood of healthy humans is currently unknown. This double-blind crossover randomized creatine monohydrate controlled pilot trial evaluated serum and skeletal muscles of creatine before and after single-dose Creafil administration in 5 healthy men. 5 is not really that many. It's not enough really subjects to prove anything really. The average age was 24. They supplemented a single dose of 5 grams of Creafil or 5 grams of creatine monohydrate with skeletal muscle levels of creatine monitored at baseline and during post-administration for 10 hours in 5-hour intervals. At each assessment in the lab, the participants completed magnetic resonance spectroscopy for right vastus medialis muscle. That's, in other words, they were tested for how much creatine was absorbed into the frontal thigh muscle. Creafil resulted in more powerful rise in vastus medialis creatine levels compared to creatine monohydrate, as evaluated with the area under the blah blah blah. In addition, no participant reported any adverse effects. These results suggest that Creafil is a preferred alternative to creatine monohydrate for improved tissue creatine bioavailability after single-dose administration. More studies are needed to evaluate its effectiveness and safety after long-term supplementation. I think that's a key point, more studies. What I'd like to see is independent studies. This was not an independent study. This study was done and sponsored or paid for by a company that's about to market this stuff. So let's see some independent studies. My gut feeling, based on the performance of all these other super creatines that I just talked about, which were all touted to be much more effective than creatine monohydrate, but when actually tested by independent researchers, were found to be no better. Now, they're not worse, except for creatine ethyl ester and liquid creatine. They were just as good as far as ergogenic, but they were no better. And the problem is they were also much, much more expensive than creatine monohydrate. I have no doubt that this new stuff is probably going to be 4, 5, 6 times more expensive than creatine monohydrate. But is it better? We'll have to see. My gut feeling is it is not. Here's my advice. Don't get it right away. Don't get it. Just like when I first started using computers, a computer expert advised me not to download the newest and greatest software. I said, why not? Why isn't it an advantage to have the newest software? He said that the newest software often has bugs. He says after about a year or so, they've worked out the bugs and the programs are more stable. Wait, give it some time before you download new software. Wait about a year, he told me. And I followed his advice, and I've done that ever since. This has been many years. I think the same is true for new supplements like this one. Don't go by these company-sponsored studies because they have an axe to grind. They're looking to make money. Wait for independent confirmation that this new creatine really is a superior form. Again, I'll repeat, my gut feeling is that it's going to be just another, hyperbolic, expensive form of creatine, no better than these other ones that I just discussed. So that's about it. Take care. If you want to have the best information you will ever find on nutrition, exercise science, hormonal therapy, anti-aging techniques, or research, fat loss techniques that work, women's health, exercise science, supplements. Subscribe today to my Applied Metabolics newsletter, www.appliedmetabolics.com. Subscribers will get, I will invite you to join my private Applied Metabolics Facebook page where I post new information on nutrition, exercise, supplements, medicine, and health every day. I also answer questions on the private Facebook page. I have an email portal on my Applied Metabolics site only for the current subscribers. I will answer short questions at no extra charge, only for subscribers, no unsolicited questions. I won't answer those. And so that's about it. Again, if you want to have the best friend you'll ever have, go to your local shelter, adopt a dog. Best in the world. Take care.